Hello everyone and welcome to this Epilepsy Research UK Hot Topics webinar on the facts about cannabinoids and epilepsy. We're delighted you could join us. Our host for today's session is Andrew Peaple. Andrew is the managing editor of the news portal The Wire China and also hosts the podcast Asia Matters. Andrew's sister Claire tragically lost her life to SUDEP, a sudden unexplained death in epilepsy, in 2002 when she was just 25 years old. We are immensely grateful to Andrew for his ongoing support of our work, not least his regular hosting of our Research Roundtable webinars. Over to you, Andrew.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be hosting this Hot Topics webinar. Cannabinoids and epilepsy have had considerable coverage in the media in recent years, and more recently has even been the focus of an EastEnders plotline. So this is a topic that Epilepsy Research UK receives a lot of questions about. And we thought we'd bring together two experts today for a special webinar to learn more about the science behind cannabinoids and epilepsy. So today we'll first be hearing from Kishan Vyas. Kishan is a registered pharmacist who has worked in the NHS and pharmaceutical industry for the last 10 years, as well as 6 years working within epilepsy in national and international medical roles. Currently, Kishan is the Associate Medical Director and Lead for the UK and Ireland at GW Pharmaceuticals, and that's a Jazz Pharmaceuticals company. We'll then hear from Professor Helen Cross OBE. Professor Cross is the Prince of Wales's Chair of Childhood Epilepsy at the UCL Institute of Child Health, Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children. Professor Cross is also President of the International League Against Epilepsy and Epilepsy Research UK, and she has led trials on cannabinoid-based drugs for rare pediatric epilepsies. Professor Cross has published widely on seizure, neuropsychological and behavioral outcomes in children who have undergone surgical resection for treatment of their epilepsy. Well, following their presentations, we'll bring both of our speakers together to answer questions that have been submitted by Epilepsy Research UK's supporters, researchers, and staff. Well, thank you to both of our speakers for taking part today. Firstly, let's hear from Kishan Vyas. And to remind you, Kishan is the Associate Medical Director at GW Pharmaceuticals. Kishan, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And as Andrew said, it's really great to be able to speak to you today. And I'm the head of medical for UK and Ireland at GW Pharmaceuticals, now a company of Jazz Pharmaceuticals. And like many others working at GW, I've got a long background in the pharmaceutical industry, having worked for companies such as UCB and GSK in various therapeutic areas. You know, my experience has been important in ensuring that GW adheres to the same high standards as for any other patient-focused research-based pharmaceutical company. And I must emphasize at this point that GW is a biopharmaceutical company that fully adheres to the UK law and industry codes of practice, such as the ABPI code. And therefore, I cannot discuss nor respond to any questions relating to specific products or medicines during this webinar. So in early 2018, the government came under pressure to make cannabis-based products more freely available for medical use following a number of high-profile cases of children with severe forms of epilepsy who were facing challenges in accessing medical cannabis products. This made what was once considered a relatively niche and developing area of medicine front-page news. Now, politicians, policymakers, patient groups, and the general public face a complex, fast-moving, and often confusing environment fraught with misunderstandings and misinformation, and this makes it very difficult to form an objective, evidence-based view on the situation and what needs to happen going forward. And as a world leader in this space, we believe that we have an important role to play in providing evidence-based information on the key issues. So why are we here today? Over the next 10 to 12 minutes, I will cover the following points, and that will be an introduction to cannabis and the science behind its medical potential, an overview of the different types of cannabis products and relevant terminology, addressing common myths and misunderstandings, an overview of the medical cannabis policy debate in the UK and the drug discovery and approval process, and what needs to happen next. So, starting with what we know and what we don't know regarding cannabis. So what is cannabis and what's legal in the UK? So cannabis is a generic term for the cannabis sativa L plant and various products made from this plant. The cannabis plant is a very versatile plant with different parts of the plant being used for different purposes. The flowers and to a lesser extent the leaves of the female plant are the most important parts of the cannabis medicine, as these contain the pharmacologically active substances called cannabinoids, including the ones that you are most likely to hear or have heard of, which are CBD and THC. The stem is mostly used for industrial purposes, such as building material, textiles, paper, etc. And the seeds are used for cosmetic uses, such as food, creating oils, and sometimes used for fish bait and industrial products. I won't dive into the detail now on exactly what is and isn't legal with regards to cannabis in the UK per se, but the key points to note are really that it's possible to get a license to grow hemp and cannabis in the UK, but under very strict conditions. Most forms of cannabis, such as recreational cannabis, are under Schedule 1 of the misuse of drugs regulations. That is essentially very tightly controlled. Pure CBD with absolutely no THC is not controlled. It is legal, but this is extremely difficult and costly to achieve, meaning most products are likely actually in Schedule 1. But those intended for medical use as set out in law are Schedule 2, which means they can be accessed by patients in very limited circumstances. This point is what we'll focus on a bit later on. So our focus today is going to be providing clarity in understanding these products and how they differ greatly in terms of its levels of evidence to support their safety, efficacy, and quality, and in the way they are regulated and made available to patients and consumers. So we will define those categories as regulatory approved cannabis-based medicines, meaning these medicines are routed through high quality clinical trial programs and approved or licensed for use by medicines regulators such as the MHRA or the European Medicines Agency or EMA. And medicines go through a rigorous regulatory review for a reason, to generate an understanding of the safety profile, their effectiveness, their risk benefit for patients, and it is essential that cannabis-based treatments go through the same level of scrutiny before they reach patients. We also have non-regulatory approved cannabis-based products. So these products are assessed via a prescription, but are not approved by medicines regulators such as the MHRA, and therefore they are unlicensed. And as they don't have the high quality evidence required for a license, these products are generally therefore called medical or medicinal cannabis. And just a bit of detail that sits behind these two categories. Regulatory approved cannabis-based medicines have the evidence that sit behind it, as I mentioned. So that will include randomized controlled trials, which are generally the gold standard for evaluating a new medicinal product to establish their safety, efficacy, and quality profile. A bit more detail into the quality side of things is providing assurance that the standards of quality are met. So that essentially means that medicines are demonstrating consistency of their composition from a batch to batch point of view during the manufacturing process. So importantly, patients and clinicians have the confidence that the medicines meet the specifications that are laid out in a product labels or the summary of product characteristics of a drug. Obviously, I've talked about the regulatory approval side of things, and the next step after regulatory approval is generally a medicine has to get routinely reimbursed, meaning that the product becomes eligible for prescription on the NHS. To be recommended by NHS reimbursement, this generally means in England, for example, we would have to do a submission to NICE, and the medicines package will include the clinical and economic evaluation to demonstrate whether the medicine works and how well the medicine works in relation to how much it would cost the NHS, i.e., does it represent value for money? What you will also see on this slide is two other categories, which are CBD containing consumer food products and recreational cannabis, but focus of today will stay on the regulatory approved cannabis-based medicines and the non-regulatory cannabis-based products. So these are the key differences between these two categories. And what you'll see is, as I've mentioned, regulatory approved cannabis-based medicines have the intended for medical use, the evidence, the quality, and the regulatory approval, which is vital to ensure that we understand the risk-benefit profile of a medicine, whereas non-regulatory approved cannabis-based products have the intended medical use, However, the amount of evidence that sits behind that is currently lacking, and we will talk about what types of evidence exist a bit later on. But it's important to remember that these are not regulatory approved and they're not reimbursed on the NHS, meaning that there still remains challenges for patients to get access to them. So what has happened in the UK in recent years, and what you'll see here is a bit of a timeline in terms of how things have progressed. So in 1997, there was discovery of cannabis, in the 1980s, there was discovery of the cannabis receptor and the endogenous cannabinoids. And as you'll see, with the amount of research that's taken place over time, legislation has changed and the amount of evidence that has happened in many different types of disease areas has started to increase as well, to the point where we've had changes in legislation and we've had changes in policy, as well as obviously moving towards getting medicines available for patients. So many of you will know some of the stories that hit the front pages. And as many of you may remember, in early 2018, the government came under significant pressure to create pathways for patients to access cannabis-based products or medicinal cannabis. And this followed the high-profile cases of some seriously ill young children with severe forms of epilepsy who were thought to be benefiting from these products, which they had accessed abroad. These cases were and are extremely distressing, and it is understandable that there was therefore a significant amount of media attention, with politicians and even celebrities lending their support to these patient campaigns. And GW deeply empathizes with these patients and their families. So how did the government and regulators respond? So having come under this sustained pressure in June 2018, the Home Secretary at the time announced a two-part review into how cannabis is scheduled. For part one, the Chief Medical Officer reviewed the medical and therapeutic benefits of regulatory approved and non-regulatory approved cannabis-based products and medicines. And having reviewed the available evidence, they concluded that there was strong evidence for their medical potential in a handful of conditions in areas where regulatory approved cannabis-based medicines exist, and reasonable evidence in several others. As a result, she felt that the Schedule 1 status should be revisited, and with a view to easing some controls and encouraging further research and patient access where the evidence supports. Part two was the Advisory Council of Misuse of Drugs, which was asked to provide an assessment based on the balance of harms and public health needs of what, if anything, should be rescheduled. And they determined that these specific products intended for medical use should be moved to Schedule 2. And the Advisory Council of Misuse of Drugs proposed a definition for these products, essentially being cannabis-based medicinal products, or CBMPs, and proposed restrictive access routes to them. Unfortunately, the reality was very different in the sense that, yes, there were clearer routes for prescribing non-regulatory approved products, which had been created as a result of these policies, but decision-making was rightly passed to health regulators, clinicians themselves, and the professional bodies that represent them. So the crucial issue of a lack of evidence remained. So although the schedule change created clearer legal routes, there was still a lack of high quality, unbiased evidence for use in patients. So accompanying this at the time, the Chief Medical Officer and NHS England outlined what change meant in practice for clinicians and pointed to interim guidance that was being issued by the British Paediatric Neurology Association and the Royal College of Physicians. And the guidance essentially asserted that the lack of high quality evidence for non-regulatory approved products means their use should be limited to a last resort. And what is clear from these recommendations was the need for priority research into clinical effectiveness of these. So since the legal change, we've seen a variety of different organizations recognize that the route to unlocking the therapeutic potential of cannabis runs through developing high quality clinical evidence. This includes the Health Select Committee's findings from its medical cannabis inquiry of 2019, that there were major gaps in the evidence of cannabis-based products. They asserted the need for randomized double-blind controlled trials as the gold standard for research. And I quote, "Without a thorough research base, products remain unlicensed and may only be prescribed if the individual prescribing doctor is satisfied that there is sufficient evidence for the product's safety and efficacy for an individual patient." They also called on industry to step up and do more to develop the products for research. And that's something that GW are committed to do. So there has been a concerted effort by government, NHS England, the MHRA, the National Institute for Health Research to encourage and incentivize clinical trials in priority areas. So what do we mean by evidence? So generally, when discussing what constitutes the highest quality of evidence, it's set out on this slide. And at GW, we believe that the efficacy of a medicine is best demonstrated through conducting rigorous clinical trials in a significant number of patients, evaluating the effectiveness and the dosing of the potential medicine in comparison to a placebo. So randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, are the tool to do that. They examine the cause and effect relationship when assessing a new medicine and are crucial for unlocking regulatory approvals for cannabis-based medicines. We have been able to do it with cannabis-based medicines, and we would urge others in the industry to invest in conducting these high-quality randomized controlled trials. And only by doing this, we will be able to generate the evidence that will lead to the necessary approvals for clinicians to be able to prescribe cannabis medicines to patients. So what you see on this slide is the European regulatory framework for medicines. And this framework is in place to ensure a high level of public health protection and the quality, safety, and efficacy of regulatory approved medicines, medicinal products requiring marketing authorization before being marketed. So the research and development stage of a medicine will include the drug discovery stage, as many of you will know, as well as the clinical trial stage, which is vital to generate data that meets the requirements for a regulatory approval. This will then be evaluated by regulators such as the MHRA or EMA, who will then authorize the use of this before having to then apply for the medicine to get reimbursed by the NHS, which is the case in the UK. Even after the NHS agree on funding, safety monitoring remains vitally important, and so would remain ongoing through the appropriate reporting systems. So, in terms of our calls to actions and a bit of recap from this talk and presentation, regulatory approved cannabis-based medicines refer to medicines rooted through the high quality clinical trial programs and approved for use by medicines regulators such as the MHRA. Non-regulatory approved cannabis-based products are defined as products for medical purposes via prescription, but not approved by these medicines regulators. Clarity is the utmost importance here, as these products differ greatly in levels of evidence to support their safety, efficacy, and quality. And therefore, a higher quality of education is needed. And the government and Health Education England have taken important steps to improve education for patients, for patient groups, and healthcare professionals to understand the risk-benefit profile for these types of products. And last but not least, there is a need for more high-quality evidence. There's been lots of discussion in recent months about observational data potentially being a route to approving cannabis-based products. As you saw from my slide, there is an accepted hierarchy of scientific evidence, with systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and RCTs being at the top of the evidence hierarchy. All other data are considered to be lower quality evidence. This system ultimately underpins the wider regulatory system and enables the likes of the MHRA to assess and approve new medicines. So please challenge people you know in the wider cannabis and pharmaceutical industry to do the hard yards to generate that high quality evidence that regulators need. And companies at the same time need, once the evidence is generated, to pursue regulatory approvals. And it's our genuine belief that the MHRA wants to do what it can to help. But until companies invest in the generation of high quality evidence, pursue these regulatory approvals and reimbursement, patients will continue to struggle to access these products. And my call to action is really to encourage companies to do the evidence needed. So thank you everybody for attending, and we will have questions a bit later on. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kishan. That was an extremely clear outline of the current situation. We'll have more questions for our guests later, but for now, I'd like to turn to Professor Helen Cross. Just to remind you, Helen is the Prince of Wales's Chair of Childhood Epilepsy at the world-famous Great Ormond Street Hospital.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you, Kishan, for that overview. There may be a degree of overlap with what I'm going to say, but I'm going to really give it from our clinical perspective and the differences with regard to different products and where the position lies with those relative products. These are my disclosures. You'll see that I do work with a number of drug companies, mainly with regard to clinical trials, but also as advisory board and also educational programs. And I need to emphasize that all monies that are paid through that go to my department and do not come to me personally. So the cannabinoids, they have been, as Kishan highlighted, they've been known throughout history and have been suggested to be beneficial in a variety of different medical conditions. And not least CBD. If you look on the internet, it's probably every single possible condition that the cannabinoids have been noted to be beneficial in, and particularly cannabidiol or CBD. And as has already been highlighted, that we need to look at not only in relation to what cannabinoids may be useful for, but also what is required with regard to development of medication for use, not only in epilepsy, but for any medical condition. There are a series of different phases that drugs will go through with regard to development. And then ultimately, the real key test are randomized controlled trials in the medical condition for which a drug may be utilized. And why do we want randomized controlled trials? Well, that's because randomization, so randomly allocating a treatment against a comparator, limits the potential for selection bias of the individual. Blinding both the clinician and, of course, the individual who's receiving the treatment minimizes information and investigation bias. And then also we predetermine prior to entry into the trials the sufficient number of individuals required to determine an accurate endpoint or outcome endpoint so that statistically this trial is valid. As Kishan has already mentioned, actually meta-analyses and systematic reviews of several randomized controlled trials are actually the gold standard when it comes to evidence for the utilization of a drug. When this systematic review was performed in 2014, the Cochrane collaboration being a key library and looking at many different questions, and particularly in the epilepsies, they only found 4 randomized trial reports in the use of cannabinoids for epilepsy. And considering there was only a total in those 4 trials of 48 patients, and all 4 of them used cannabidiol as a treatment agent, you can see that they were extremely small. And not only that, the reports were very limited, and in many cases, the outcomes weren't actually reported. And therefore, at that stage, as recently as 2014, no reliable conclusions could be drawn with regard to the efficacy of the cannabinoids in epilepsy, although they suggested that they may be beneficial. When we talk about a cannabis-based medicinal product, and I know this has been mentioned in brief, there are key components that it may be defined as. It contains cannabis, cannabis resin, cannabinol, or cannabinol derivative. It's produced for medicinal use in humans, and it's a medicinal product or a substance or preparation for use as an ingredient of a medicinal product, or a substance for use in the preparation or manufacture of an ingredient of medicinal products. And just to summarize where we are at the change in legislation, the Advisory Committee on Misuse of Drugs gave advice to the Home Secretary on the utilization of this following a lot of discussion and lobbying to Parliament. And basically, this is when the advice was to move those products with a clear definition as a cannabis-based medicinal product out of Schedule 1 status into Schedule 2, that there would be an option to prescribe these products that meet requirements, that those products meet requirements for medicinal standards, and that there should be checks and balances to maintain safe prescribing and to avoid harm. And these were accepted in July 2018. This didn't mean, however, that products were freely available for prescription. We can now think of 3, possibly 4 groups of cannabis-based medicinal products that are available in the UK. There are medicines that or may be classed as cannabis-based medicinal products according to the degree of data, the degree of availability and license, and indeed their quality assurance. There are medicines that are authorised in the UK and as well, of course, other EU member states, as well as in the US. And for example, Epidiolex, which is pure cannabidiol produced by GW Pharmaceuticals, which is licensed to be used in conjunction with clobazam, so not on its own, for treatment-resistant epilepsy associated with Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, two particular complex epilepsies. There are also, you can class medicines that have undergone randomized controlled trials and have a European approval. Currently, that's only Epidiolex, and that's in epilepsy associated with tuberous sclerosis complex. And actually, interestingly, that's without clobazam. There are then products which are non-licensed, but are called GMP and GDP standard products, which there are varying preparations that have different combinations and proportions of cannabidiol and tetrahydrocannabinol, THC. They've not undergone assessment in randomized controlled trials, and as far as we're aware, are not in the process of being applied for an EMA license. I'll come to exactly what that means shortly. And there are other products, non-licensed, non-GMP, non-GDP standard products that are also freely available, even for purchase on the internet. And these are artisanal cannabis oils, utilized as hemp oils, less than 0.2% THC. And again, I'll come to those in a second and the problem we have with these. So what about the first group? This is essentially cannabidiol, otherwise marketed as Epidiolex, as produced by GW Pharma. And GW Pharmaceuticals, as it now is, has been involved in the development of cannabinoids in a pharmaceutical way since 2007, particularly looking at epilepsy, and have produced a pure cannabidiol, Epidiolex, that has been was initially trialed in looked at in an open label fashion, but subsequently for which there have been 6 randomized controlled trials, 3 in Dravet syndrome, particularly complex early onset epilepsy that has been traditionally prone to poor prognosis for seizure control and indeed neurodevelopmental outcome, although one of the trials was actually a dose-finding study. A randomized controlled trials, 2 of them in Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, another complex early onset epilepsy, again, extremely poor prognosis traditionally for seizure control. There's also now published very recently a randomized controlled trial at epilepsy associated with tuberous sclerosis, a genetic condition associated with structural problems in the brain and a very high prevalence of epilepsy. And there is also the open label continuation from the trials published in Dravet and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which has shown the retention. And on all these trials, it's shown to be a significant benefit of add-on cannabidiol over the addition of placebo, these all being double-blind randomized controlled trials. And so that has led to the status with regard to the current approval for Epidiolex in the treatment of the epilepsies. The approval, as listed by the European Medicines Agency, although also the FDA in the United States, seizures associated with Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, and from the European license only an utilization of it in association with clobazam. That's the way the data were assessed, although many of us feel it's not that's not entirely required, but that is something for which more data will be required. And as a result of that, the NICE had a health technology appraisal in 2019, reporting in January 2020, again for approval of prescription on the NHS of Epidiolex in a combination with clobazam for seizures associated with Dravet and Lennox-Gastaut syndromes. Although there is a European approval for utilization of Epidiolex in epilepsy associated with tuberous sclerosis, not in association with clobazam, it's not yet gone through that NICE HTA approval process. So that's the first group, namely products that have gone through RCTs and indeed have been approved. And at the present time, that is only pure cannabidiol as produced by GW Pharmaceuticals or Epidiolex. The second group of products are what we call GMP and GTP standard products. And the main issue is GMP, good manufacturing practice, the minimum standard that a medicine manufacturer must meet in their production processes. There are various preparations that meet this standard with differing combinations of CBD and THC. But there is no high quality scientific or clinical evidence, namely randomized controlled trials, to support the suggestion that the addition of THC, and if you remember, this is the part of the cannabis plant that causes the psychoactive effects, the highs, although in these there's relatively small doses. That said, there is then no evidence that that's required in addition to CBD to get more of an effect in the epilepsies, and indeed no safety data for the addition of THC. And if we think about the fact that it acts on the brain, what effect may it have on the developing brain in already compromised individuals? We need data with regard to that. And therefore, thereafter, these products are not licensed. And as far as we're aware, there's no current plan for submission for license. And therefore, they will not move through they're not moving through the regulatory process, and indeed the approval process for prescription. And then finally, there are the cannabis oils that seem to be available in a lot of places, not least over the internet and in health food shops. And these indeed are dietary supplements. They are supposedly 0.2%, less than 0.2% THC, which makes them legal, but also very low concentrations of CBD. And there is the one thing to say is that these are not open to quality assurance. Namely, it has been demonstrated in studies that even in the same batch, there is a high degree of variability in what is contained within these oils. And also thereafter, it's absolutely limited with regard to knowing what sort of doses might be required to be utilised. These are therefore non-prescribable and not advisable in clinical practice. So looking at what we have available, there are, of course, remaining questions. What is the role of cannabidiol in epilepsies beyond Dravet, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, and epilepsy with tuberous sclerosis? And from other studies, there is a suggestion it's not necessarily, the effect is not related to the type of epilepsy, but this is where we have randomized controlled trials, and hence why the approval process has been limited to that. And the other question is, what is the role of THC? Does it confer additional efficacy in the epilepsies? Is it safe? We don't know. And indeed, these are the questions that were raised as priority research questions in the NICE guidelines on cannabis-based medicinal products, where they felt there wasn't evidence to prescribe anything other than Epidiolex in the epilepsies currently. There's no doubt that we as clinicians and others in the community recognise that there is an unmet need in the treatment of many of the individuals with particularly complex epilepsies, ongoing seizures, despite our standard anti-epileptic treatment. And we are continually looking for novel therapies that we may be able to trial. And with the requirement for further data, we in principle, myself and colleagues, have funding agreed for 2 randomized control trials in both one study in early onset epilepsies with onset under the age of 3, and in another group in an older population with relatively normal cognition in the drug-resistant genetic generalized epilepsies, in order that we can do the appropriate outcome measures. The study design will specifically measure the effect of 3 arms in each group of patients: a CBD product, a CBD plus THC based product, and then also a placebo arm. And it will, of course, be double blind. The study start date, although we've had funding agreed in principle, is reliant on securing a suitable cannabis-based medicinal product with the 2 components, and also placebo, that are all indistinguishable with regard to smell and taste, and as a supply for the trial, because if it's double blind, then we need to make sure nobody can determine any difference in the products. And we are getting close to that, and we hope to be recruiting first patients into these studies early next year. With that, I hope that we'll be able to answer some questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Helen, for that presentation, and again, a very clear and informative presentation. I just wanted to ask you one follow-up on those tests that you talked about that might be getting underway next year. Just to give us an illustration, typically how many people do need to be involved in RCTs to make them viable and to make their results meaningful, and typically how long a period do these tests take?
When we're assessing medicines, you're actually trying to determine the sample size in advance that's required, dependent on the effect that you are expecting. And that's the way you calculate it statistically. Certainly in each of these studies, there will be in excess of 200 patients because there are 3 arms. So we're looking at around 500 patients that will be recruited in all. This will be a multi-site study involving the whole of the UK. So, and also stretching from children to adults. In both arms, the adults will be included. But yeah, that's the total number.
I see. Well, Kishan, I'd love for you to come back online at this point as well, so that I can ask you both some of the questions that have been submitted and some other questions that we might have, and to thank you again for your presentations. Of course, this is a controversial area. We understand very much the feelings of families and so on that are involved in this situation, and are often desperate to find solutions to the problems of their children and so on and so forth. And so this topic, of course, has been in the headlines frequently in recent years, and there's been a lot of information shared online, some of which hasn't been supported by the science, as you've illustrated. Helen, maybe turn to you first. Could you summarize then the current situation with cannabinoids? Who can prescribe them and who can have access to them?
I want to emphasize again that we as a clinician community are totally sympathize with the fact that families are looking for treatments that may help their children or the individuals they're caring for. And, I see day to day in my clinics, many children where they continue to have seizures despite our standard treatments. And, we do see the concern about the harm that seizures may be causing, let alone what the underlying cause of the epilepsy may be causing. But that said, we also have a duty to be secure that whatever we do prescribe, we have a knowledge base as to what we're prescribing, and indeed we feel it is safe, and that we're not going to lead to further problems down the line. There is a perception, I think, that because cannabis-based medicinal products are plant-derived, then they're natural. But many of our drugs have been derived from plants, and some have been found to be incredibly harmful when used in an incorrect way. So we do need standardization of what's in the product, as well, to make sure we know reliably what we're giving, as well as the knowledge base that it is safe. So where are we? We know that we have Epidiolex, it's pure cannabidiol, that has been trialed in randomized trials, and we've got short and longer term follow-up with safety data with regard to that. And that will be ongoing as well, even post-marketing with regard to that. What we don't have at the present time is safety data or indeed knowledge as to whether THC is required. And that does concern us in a population of children who already have significant learning and behavior difficulties. What are we up to make sure that we're not leading to further problems down the line? It's all very well maybe having a gain in the short term, but we don't want to have problems for those individuals in the longer term down the line. So we want to be secure that it is safe. So at the present time, we as a group of pediatric neurologists feel that we do have evidence base for Epidiolex. There is a question as to whether that could be used outside of the license, but again, that's not reimbursed currently, and that's something we have to address. But with regard to other products, we do not feel that we have the data to prescribe that currently. And, you know, although the guidance suggests that if there is any prescription of that product, people have to be secure in what they're doing, have a knowledge base with regard to that, and therefore they have been prescribed by certain individuals privately. There is a consensus amongst pediatric neurologists that we should not be prescribing these outside the context of a clinical trial.
I understand. Kishan, we've seen headlines related to changes in government policy, which you covered in your presentation. In your experience, has this yet changed prescribing practice? And if not, why is that?
Yeah, I mean, what government policy changes have done is really enabled clinicians to be able to access those medicines that have obviously gone through the randomized controlled trial and approval process route, and the reimbursement process route that follows on from that as well. So you could argue that actually the government legislation has supported ensuring that access to these types of medicines that have gone through this route has become easier for clinicians to be able to prescribe in those patients that are eligible to prescribe based on the license and evidence that exists. And following on from that, obviously, we've also had statements from various clinician groups, such as the BPNA, which is the British Pediatric Neurology Association, as well as clinicians working and heavily involved with the likes of NICE in creating guidelines to support changes in government legislation as well. And as we build and create further evidence, we're hoping that ultimately the government guidance will continue to support and move with the evidence that ultimately continues to be generated going forwards.
Now, Helen, if I can, I'd love to get some insights into what it's like working in this area. I mean, you led the first clinical trial into cannabinoids for epilepsy in the world. I mean, that must have been pretty nerve-wracking and exciting experience. Can you tell us a bit more about that trial and the findings of the study and what it was like working on that study?
Sure. So I was first approached many years ago, actually, to utilize the pharmaceutical product, as it is now, Epidiolex, in a single individual where there did appear to be demonstration of benefit. And it was that time where you feel, well, this is an interesting product. It appears to be, it is a pharmaceutical product. The plan is to go through the randomized controlled trials. And it showed benefit and led to the initial open label studies on compassionate use, which then led to the development of the clinical trial. And, at the time, we decided that we should look at specific patient groups, because that actually allows us to look at smaller populations of individuals. That said, of course, when you look at a very specific group, then that limits the data to that very specific group. So we can weigh up as to whether that was the way to go, but we are where we are. But I have to say, being part of development of a novel therapy for the treatment for these very complex children was very exciting, and also very time consuming, understandably, because we have to go through all the discussions with regard to the trial protocol and indeed what outcomes would be best. And of course, these accounts are always the outcomes that we have to look at, but there were other softer outcomes, such as whether there thought to be benefit on the part of the carer and indeed the clinician, which also showed significant change. So it was an exciting time, although complex and time consuming.
A question for you both following on from that. What other research is taking place around the UK now, and indeed internationally, to investigate the use of cannabinoids for treating epilepsy? Maybe Helen, I'll start with you and come to Kishan afterwards on that.
Where I think there are certain pockets of areas where, again, there continue to be what we call open label studies. They're not double blind. So it's the addition of cannabinoid products with cannabidiol with THC to existing medication in populations and continue to be reported. and data collected on registries with regard to this. But we're not aware, I think there are now emerging the suggestion of some randomized controlled trials from different areas, although there are none currently in progress, as far as I'm aware, with the CBD or the THC. It is difficult because in some countries there is already a market for these products that may be compromised if we go through this full process. But that said, we are committed to doing a clinical trial and are well on the way to seeing that materialize.
Kishan, you talked about the involvement of the private sector here. What are you seeing in terms of other activity in this area?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, just to echo what Helen has said, in terms of understanding what additional evidence is happening within epilepsy at the moment, there are not many studies per se. However, we are looking at exploring, obviously, what other potential conditions potentially will get a benefit from doing evidence generation and RCT. So that's currently happening in private sector in terms of understanding what other potential conditions, and as Helen mentioned, we've talked about Dravet syndrome and then it's Gasto syndrome, tuberous sclerosis complex, but there are other conditions as well. And really understanding that feasibility and being able to understand whether there will be a potential benefit in these conditions, other conditions, is currently at the moment happening to understand whether it's feasible to do these types of studies. So, my suggestion would be to continue to encourage companies to invest in RCTs, to continue to explore different conditions as well, to see whether there will be a benefit. And, this is happening internationally as well, of course, as well. In other countries, they are also doing that same feasibility. Maybe evidence doesn't exist in certain populations in those countries, and that's happening too.
Helen, there is some evidence that cannabinoids have worked well in other conditions. Multiple sclerosis would be one example. To what extent can learning from that experience be applied to epilepsy? Is that something that can work across conditions, or are there limitations to that?
There are limitations in the sense that you're looking at different outcomes. I mean, what we're looking in MS is probably relinquishing of spasticity, and that's where we have a product, Sativex, is also produced by GW Pharma, that has been trialed for utilization in that. And I know there's a big interest in the community with regard to utilizing the other products in that, but it is for improving spasticity, so stiffening in the limbs as a result of the neurological condition. The cannabinoids have also been used for pain and also nausea in association with oncological or cancer treatments. So that's a different area. But of course, in the epilepsies, that we're looking at recurrent epileptic seizures, and that is the primary outcome. Whether there are other outcomes the families are looking for, that is the measurable outcome and what is required with regard to regulatory approval. So it is very difficult, other than looking perhaps at adverse effects, to transfer any of that data to the epilepsies.
Kishan, your perspective on this question, if you could, please.
Yeah, sure. And we've talked about the actual potential properties of cannabinoids in general. And the science is one of those areas that is continuing to evolve over time, understanding not just the properties of a single cannabinoid, but also combinations of different cannabinoids as well. And as Helen outlined, there are numerous different potential combinations you can have, but we still don't understand what the safety profile in the short term or the long term of that would be for those medicines that actually haven't had the research done in them. So, it's such an evolving area of science at the moment. And we've talked about the epilepsies, we've talked about, and as you mentioned, multiple sclerosis and spasticity in multiple sclerosis. But there are so many other areas of science that are yet to be explored in terms of the potential of cannabinoids, things like pain, etc., that we hear about in the media and so on. But again, as I say, that evidence and those trials need to be conducted for us to really understand whether we actually see those sorts of benefits in a clinical trial setting.
Absolutely. Helen, you've talked about the sheer numbers of people that are involved in RCTs. How valuable then is the involvement of patients and families in epilepsy research and in the pathway to drug regulation?
There's no question that getting patient views, family views is extremely important in developing any research, not least the protocols, to know for clinical trials, to know whether visits are appropriate, measurements, outcomes that we're measuring are appropriate, what the different thoughts are with regard to that. And we have, even in the development of our clinical trials, we've been involving charitable organisations, disease specific support groups to gain input into what we're doing. And also built into the protocol is continued patient and public involvement, which is a requirement for many of the studies and is absolutely important to make sure whatever we're doing or even the findings are applicable and ongoing. I think something that has been really being looked at, but has still is very difficult, is what outcomes are important, particularly to the complex patient group. And it's not the fact that seizures are not important. Of course, they're important, but there are a variety of other things which are much more difficult to measure, such as neurodevelopmental gains, neurobehavioral management, sleep, all these components, which can be very difficult to measure. The other side, of course, is many of the clinical trials are very short duration. So they're only 3-4 months long. And, what happens in the longer term, and that's where the open label follow-up is so important. And, there are studies now looking at composite outcomes and have had sought the opinion of these families. Seizures are still there as important, but actually cognition, expressive and receptive communication, so speech, language, communication is really important, as well as day-to-day living and quality of life.
Well, thank you again, both of you, for such a informative webinar. We do ask all of our speakers this one final question, which is, what are your hopes for future research into epilepsy and for people living with epilepsy? Kishan, could I turn to you first on that? What are your hopes in this area?
Sure. And, my hopes is most importantly ensuring that any patient who requires access to potential medicine that can help them can get access to that as much as possible. And, our hope is that science and evidence continues to evolve, that we continue to produce the high quality evidence that's needed to support uses of new medicines that do come onto the market for the epilepsies and for other conditions, of course, as well. And, I would say that, as I emphasized in my talk, we continue to encourage that science and evidence to evolve, working with companies, working with governments, working with clinicians, and of course, working with epilepsy research and other patient groups and patients themselves to ensure that together we can continue to drive change as we go with the evolving evidence.
Thank you. Helen, your thoughts here, please.
Well, as I move in my day-to-day practice, there is still a huge unmet need. We still have a similar proportion of individuals with epilepsy resistant to medication as we did 30 years ago. And that's probably in part because we're tackling the same issue, and in part because we haven't had the understanding as we do now of the underlying causes of the epilepsies. And therefore, my hope is as we move forward, we get more of that understanding, we find more treatments. If the cannabinoids are more of an answer, that we know it needs to be assessed and trialed with regard to both efficacy and safety, so that as we move forward, we can really tackle at an early stage in a natural history of a condition appropriate treatments that are going to lead to resolution of seizures.
Well, thank you both once again for taking part in today's webinar and for the important work that you both do. We know there are currently 1,100 epilepsy-related deaths in the UK every year. So that's equivalent to about 21 each week. So all the work that you're doing and the time you've taken today to explain that work is incredibly valuable. So thank you so much. This has been a really interesting hot topic webinar discussing the science and the facts behind cannabinoids and epilepsy. So thank you both so much. And with that, I would like to hand back to Quiva.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and huge thank yous to Kishan and Helen for joining us today to present on this highly requested topic. Certainly one of the take-home points for me has been that there is so much more evidence needed, but not just any evidence, it's the high quality evidence that we need in this area. And it's so promising to hear of the really exciting studies that are coming up in the near future. So huge thank you to both of you for speaking on these topics, and a huge thank you to Andrew Peaple for joining and for hosting this session. That's been really brilliant. And thank you to James and Becca, who have been ensuring that the tech runs smoothly as well. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of you for tuning in and joining us for this Hot Topics webinar. If you're watching and your life has been interrupted by epilepsy, you can help shape the future of research into epilepsy by joining our SHAPE Epilepsy Research Network. We heard from Helen earlier about how critical the involvement of people affected by epilepsy in research really is to changing things for the future and to shaping how research works. So the link to the SHAPE network will be on screen now, and will also be in the chat section of this Zoom. So thank you again to all of our speakers, to Professor Helen Cross, to Kishan Vyas, and to Andrew Peaple for hosting the session. Thank you.